Well, hello there, and welcome to the 23rd Infinite Inning Reissue episode. I thank you for being here. I, myself, am Stephen Goldman. Who else would I be? Kind of redundant to say I myself. And yet I did, just in case either of us had any confusion about that. We go back this week to episode number 21, early in the run of the show. More about that in a minute. This portion of our reissue experience is dimly about eschatology, but also about the very devout Colorado Rockies. And being very devout, they must be interested in eschatology. If you want to know what I think about this in a more concrete way than I'm going to discuss here, read Otherlands, A Journey Through Earth's Extinct Worlds by Thomas Halliday. That contains a pretty good set of previews for where I think the human experience will ultimately end up, or at least resolve. When I was a kid, I had a bad experience with Nostradamus, not in person, but close enough. My parents used to take me, my sister, and 3 cats on these long cross-country car trips during the summers, late in the summers. So we barely made it back in time for school. And, well, sometimes we didn't. My folks were not wealthy. Only one of them was their own boss, and I don't wholly understand where they found the time or the money, but somehow they did. And as with every movie on this subject, sometimes being trapped with one's family in that way was wonderful, and sometimes it was the worst thing that ever happened to you, but I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. One of those several trips, I believe it happened in the very early 1980s, saw us spend some time in and around the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. I was just young enough that for a moment I took the name of the mountain range seriously. I expected to see some smoking mountains. One day it was a bit foggy. Smoke really did seem to rise off the mountains, and I felt validated. One of the main entrances to the national park lies at Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and we paused there for a day or so. I don't know what it's like today. It has been a long time, but it felt to me at that time and at that point in my life, well, very cheesy. It was there to take some money off of the tourists before they took in some nature. And no doubt you've seen a number of places like that around the country that try to take advantage of their proximity to the national parks. In my memory, it very much resembled a more rural version of what Times Square in New York later became. I don't mean the version that we have now with so many lights that you can see the place from Betelgeuse, but what I mean is that at the time, in the early 80s, Times Square and the adjacent areas of Manhattan just featured sex shops. I'd be in the city to go to a museum or a play, and we'd pass marquee after marquee saying, "Live nude show, live sex." And my curiosity would be piqued in a very different way from what it was we were going to see. Never did satisfy it. Many of these. Should I? I wouldn't know where to go. I've seen a lot of things in my life. I've never seen that, at least not professionally. If you think about it, it should be an Olympic event. But getting back on subject, many of those theaters, probably all of them, hadn't been purpose-built, but rather once upon a time had been legit theaters and movie houses, but the culture could no longer support them, and so these lower rent industries moved in. But 10 or 15 years later, all of that was gone, replaced by faux attractions and middling chain restaurants. And that's what Gatlinburg felt like to me around 1980. Faux attractions. I'm sure there were chain restaurants too, but I don't recall those. I'm embarrassed to admit that I was not immune to the lure of faux attractions. There was a Ripley's Believe It or Not museum in town, and I was very intrigued by that. I should have said that like this: Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. I'm trying to get the quotation marks in there so you know that I understand it was not a real museum. I don't exactly remember why it intrigued me so much. I've never known, actually. Immediately after, when I started regretting things, I asked myself that question. I was, from a very young age, interested in past culture and things like old comic strips. So I probably had seen Robert Ripley's Comics Panel, the thing that started that brand, but they're boring. They're kind of tedious. I would take almost any other Golden Age comic strip over Ripley's Believe It or Not. I don't mean to brag when I say that even as a little kid, Crazy Cat, which I've talked about on this show a number of times, appealed to me more than something as flat and as filled with useless trivia, and I am nothing but fascinated by useless trivia, as Ripley's Believe It or Not. See, that was boring, useless trivia. It still has to have some interest to it. And whereas today, many people refer to Crazy Cat as art, and it is, and it's been republished in many forms over the years, people still write about it. No one is clamoring for a giant coffee table book of old Ripley's panels. So it wasn't that, and I don't think it was the TV show that ran on ABC on Saturdays for about 5 years, the one that was hosted by Jack Palance. I don't think it had happened yet. I did know that a young Sparky Schultz, as a kid, had gotten his dog Spike mentioned in a Ripley's panel. Spike was one of his models for Snoopy, but that wouldn't have motivated me to beg my parents to buy me a pass into that building. All I really know is that I had a young boy's fascination with the macabre, the frightening, the eerie, and I thought I could find that kind of stimulation in that building. What I also knew, but didn't like to admit, was that I really couldn't handle any of that, the implications of it all. I was always reading scary books and things and then hiding them on myself, or watching movies I wasn't ready to watch, because as a latchkey kid, no one was going to stop me from watching them, and then I couldn't fall asleep at night. So I badgered my parents into taking me into this thing that they had to know was garbage, a freak show at best. And it must have been terribly unimpressive because I remember almost nothing about it except for one thing. And that one thing blocks out everything else. Somewhere in that building was an exhibit, hear those quotes again, about the 16th century French astrologer Nostradamus. I hadn't heard of him before that. There was a paragraph explanation of this guy that he made all these predictions and they were always right, and that he predicted that the world would end in 1983 or 84 or 85, some date of destruction that was imminent, that was just around the corner. At least that's how I remember it. I think what he actually said was 1999, or maybe that was Prince. Either way, it scared the hell out of me for the rest of the trip, and we still had literally thousands of miles to go around the North American continent. I was an anxious and depressed wreck with the hand of doom upon my neck, of the extinction of myself and everyone I loved. I had hours a day in the back seat to contemplate the termination of all as faceless miles of the Great Plains rolled by outside the window. Funny thing, one of the cassettes my dad would play on the stereo again and again during that trip was a greatest hits of Perry Como. And what was one of Perry Como's greatest hits? That he would love you till the end of time. I was inclined to that sort of morbid thinking to begin with because it was the Cold War, the age of Ronald Ray guns, and the idea of nuclear annihilation was very much on people's minds. Both the television film The Day After and the theatrical film Testament, both of them about the aftermath of a nuclear attack, came out in 1983. The film adaptation of Stephen King's The Dead Zone, partially about an insane president starting a nuclear war, also came out in 1983, as did the somewhat lighter War Games, the Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy adventure film about a rogue computer taking over at NORAD and starting a civilization-ending war. Something was in the air, and you just had to hope it wasn't a missile. For no reason at all, that experience had popped into my head early yesterday, and then that night, rather unintentionally, I watched Mike Leigh's 1993 film Naked. It just happened past me, and I'm really liking Mike Leigh films. I'm catching up on his back catalog from time to time, and it's about some very disaffected Londoners at that time, and there's a discussion of Nostradamus in there as well. So it's like I was being kicked in the head by this memory. I was prepared to say to you just now that the end of the world may be imminent, and yet the Colorado Rockies still have neither a team president nor a general manager. But as I opened my mouth to speak, that became no longer true. They finally found the man to head their front office, and it is former A's wonder boy, defrocked Dodgers general manager, 10-year strategic something or other for the Cleveland Browns, an organization known neither for on-field success nor good process. He's been in football the last 10 years, Paul DePodesta. And I can only say to Mr. DePodesta, God bless you and good luck, because you really have your work cut out for you. And at least I know that this man understands what on-base percentage is, which is something that no other Rockies executive ever has been able to say. Let me interrupt myself this much, though. This guy has been with the Browns for 10 years, which means in some way he was in the decision-making chain about the Deshaun Watson trade. If I've got my chronology right, the quarterback was first accused of sexual assault in 2021, and they traded for him in 2022. And that he's barely played since then is sort of beside the point, except that it means the deal was bad morally and bad in a purely athletic sense. And so we turn to another chapter of Rockies baseball that may not be all that promising here at the edge of everything. And so let me give them some advice. If the end of the world were imminent, or Rob Manfred was just going to really screw up the 2027 season with a lockout, and I could take over the Rockies, I think that for 2026, I would just shoot the entire bank account, checking and savings, and give the fans a home run palooza. Just really lean into the ballpark, not into winning, into the show. I'd tell agents I'm not going to be outbid, sign Pete Alonso and Eugenio Suarez and Kyle Schwarber and any other free agent on the block with plus power. That team wouldn't win because I'm not signing any pitching, damn it. But the fans can come out and see a daily home run derby from both sides. Nowadays, teams routinely hit over 200 home runs and post losing records anyway, just because the ball is filled with helium and sugar cocoa bombs. But prior to the post-1994-1995 stoppage, when things were a little more balanced, it had happened only 4 times in the nearly 75 years since the lively ball was introduced in 1920. So here's what I'm getting at. In 1964, just one example, the Minnesota Twins led the American League in home runs by hitting 221 of them. Even the shortstop, future AL MVP Zoilo Versalles, hit 20 home runs. But the big numbers came from first base and the outfield. Bob Allison, who mostly played corner outfield in his career, was jumping between first and the pastures, with Don Mincher taking over at first when he was away. Mincher was a lefty slugger who probably would have hit over 300 of them, home runs if he had come up earlier or later, but playing in the 60s and 70s just wasn't conducive to that. As it was, he hit 200, including 23 in just 320 at-bats in 1964. Allison hit 32 on his own. Center fielder Jimmy Hall hit 25, right fielder Tony Oliva 32, and left fielder Harmon Killebrew led the league with 49. Despite all that power, they finished 7th in a 10-team league, going 79 and 83. The pitching was decent, with Jim Cott, Camilo Pascual, a half season of Mudcat Grant. Their Pythagorean record, their expected record based on runs scored and allowed, was 87 and 75. So my glib analysis here is simply that they had bad luck and needed perhaps one more starting pitcher. They opened the season with a rotation of Pascual, Cott, Dick Stigman, Lee Stang, the E at the end of Stange is silent, and Jim Rowland. The latter 3 pitchers had their moments over the course of their careers, but they weren't very good in 1964. The Twins realized that, and they attempted to repair it by trading Stang and third base prospect George Banks to Cleveland at the June 15th deadline. That's how they got Grant. It wasn't too late. They were only 3.5 games behind, but it wasn't enough. They'd be 10 games under 500 the rest of the way. In 1965, though, Grant paid off, going 21-7 with a 3.30 ERA, as the Twins won 102 games and the pennant. This is all interesting from a team-building point of view, but my real game here is that with all those fireworks going on, an also-ran Twins team finished 3rd in the American League in attendance and 7th overall in the major leagues, and were one of 7 teams to draw over 1.2 million fans. So they made bank, is what I'm saying. Not that making bank matters when the world is coming to an end. You can't take it with you, folks, so enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. I realize the Rockies draw because it's a nice day at the ballpark, even when they're terrible, but I think they would really draw this way. And they would give the fans something to look at, even if winning another pennant remains a subject for further research. And won't it be fun to see the home runs sail into the distance as volcanoes pop off in the background? My other takeaway from this, watch out for your imaginative, impressionable children. They may not be talking about it out loud, but their emotions may be churning under the surface. Look up, shouts the child inwardly. Is that an airplane, a shooting star, or an ICBM? This week, we go back, as I said earlier, to episode 21 of The Infinite Inning to 2 stories of Hall of Fame catchers under duress. The first concerns Roger Bresnahan and a horrific train crash, the latter Mickey Cochran and the crashing noises produced by everyday life. I don't think there's a topical hook for this, except, as usual, empathy. That's all from me for this reissue episode. I'll be back periodically if I need to be to paper over some breaks, and you'll hear from me to say farewell at the end. Our reissue adventure begins right after this brief intermission, so fasten your seatbelts, hold down your helmets, and pull up your trousers, I suppose. This isn't one of those shows I used to wonder about in Times Square.
A trip to the infinite inning can determine the outcome of a pennant race as much as the talent on the team, vagaries of the schedule, or lucky bounces of the ball. The player-manager of the 1911 St. Louis Cardinals was Roger Bresnahan, 32 years old and a tough guy. He's in the Hall of Fame as a catcher, and perhaps simply because, as a catcher, he popularized the wearing of shin guards and a face mask rather than just standing a ways back behind the bat and hoping that every bone in your face didn't get broken. But he was also a tremendous player, a leadoff man with a career on-base percentage of nearly 400, and a star on John McGraw's early Giants teams. He was not a soft guy. During his career, people thought of him as having an Irish temper because he was born over there. But in fact, he was from Toledo. The Irish temper, though, was real. Bill James said of him, almost every paragraph written about him seemed to include the adjective fiery. He was one of those guys that if you were on his team and played hard, he was as nice to you as could be. But if you got on his bad side, you'd think he was the breath of hell. Retrosheet lists 30 ejections for Bresnahan as a player and another 26 as a manager. He only managed 5 years. My favorite story about him, about his intensity, was the one about how he got to be catcher in the first place. See, Bresnahan played a bit of everywhere, came up as a pitcher, moved to the outfield, spotted at third base. But one day he was talking to McGraw, and he said, "Our catcher sucks. Why don't you get a real catcher on this team?" And McGraw, probably just being sarcastic or drunk or hostile or both, he was usually one of those three, if not all of them, said, "You think it's so easy? You do it." And so, from then on, Bresnahan was a catcher and was awesome at it. This was not a guy who got pushed around easily. And yet, everyone has their breaking point. On the night of July 11th of that year, the Cardinals were changing series. They had just finished a 4-game set with the Phillies in Philadelphia and had dropped the last game. They won 3 of 4, but the last game they had the misfortune to run into a rookie named Grover Cleveland Alexander. The Phillies were a pretty good team that year, and as the Cardinals taking 3 of 4 from them suggests, so were they. At the conclusion of that game, they were 10 games over 500 and on a pace for 87 wins, a little uptick, and you could imagine a pennant being in the offing. They were in 5th place, but it was a tightly packed league, and they were only 3 games back. So running into Pete Alexander aside, things were looking up. That night, they got on the Federal Express, a train that ran from Washington to Boston to go play the Braves. It was a big train, an important train, on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. It was the same train that William Howard Taft, who was president at that moment, liked to take when he went out of town. The Cardinals occupied 2 sleeper cars out of 6 in total. There was also a day coach full of convention goers returning from Atlantic City where they'd attended the annual meeting of the Northern Christian Endeavorers. In addition, there was a car full of fish. Sounds a bit surreal, but the government was bringing a load of fish to be seeded into lakes. I'm not really sure. The train's consist had the Cardinals coaches up towards the front, not too far behind the engine and the tender. Bresnahan complained his players couldn't sleep from all the noise. When the train crossed into Manhattan, they actually listened to him. It was broken up and reordered. This added an hour-and-a-half delay, and the 2 Cardinals cars were moved way to the back of the train. At that moment, a relief engineer was also called in, presumably a more rested driver to finish the trip up to Boston. Thing was that he didn't know the route as well as the guy he had replaced. They took off again. A mile and a half out of Bridgeport, Connecticut, the train hit an embankment, going 60 miles an hour where the speed limit was only 15. It jumped the track, plunged, depending on what you read, 15 to 30 feet. The day coach, the car that replaced the Cardinals car in the lineup, suffered the most damage of any car in the train. It was just destroyed utterly. The engine, the tender, and 7 other cars were completely wrecked. The engineer and the fireman were hurled 60 feet from the wreck and crushed beneath the tender. Most of the injured were pinned by wreckage, and the responding firemen carefully had to chop them free with axes. The living were intertwined with the dead, sometimes their family members. There was a Sergeant G.E. Rogers of the United States Coast Artillery traveling on the train with his wife, his 3-year-old son, and his 1-month-old daughter. He and the boy took an upper berth, his wife and the daughter a lower one. When the train wrecked, he and the boy were thrown clear. Somehow his body protected that of his son, and they were able to crawl out of the train. He couldn't find his wife and his baby girl. It was only later, after frantic digging, that their bodies were found. The Cardinals were digging too. Thanks to their spot at the rear of the train, they were thrown around quite a bit and suffered scrapes and bruises, but no serious injuries. Hadn't realized what happened at first, and then slowly they stumbled out of the train still in their pajamas, pulling on random items of clothing. And as you would expect ball players to do, they jumped in to help with the rescue effort. Rebel Oaks, the center fielder on that team, said the cars that had fallen onto the street were piled up like a monster heap of kindling. Men, women, and children were sticking out of the debris. Some had arms cut off, others were minus legs, in some instances the tops of heads had been crushed. Among the passengers was a man who was returning from the funeral of his sister, Oakes continued. He was accompanied by his wife, 2 children, and his brother. Only himself and one of the children had escaped. It was pitiful to hear him calling aloud for his wife and children as he dashed about the wreck searching for them. Rube Geyer, a pitcher, said, I helped to carry out a woman who had 2 boards protruding from her body. Her head was split open. I heard that she died subsequently. One of the toughest sights was that of the little babies, crushed and mangled. There were 14 killed, 47 injured, and the St. Louis Cardinals must have seen most of them. When they finally got into Boston, the game had to be canceled because of how late they showed up. Bresnahan said, it was horrible. Horrible. What effect it will have upon the nerve of my men can only be told from their future performance upon the diamond. Remember, this is a very hard man in a hard-bitten era. Baseball had that ethic. Everything was a test of your manhood. Everything was about bearing down and gritting your teeth and gutting it out. Wasn't a lot of room for sentiment. But as we now know, traumatic events do have a long-term effect on you sometimes. They move in and they stay. Almost 50 years earlier, Charles Dickens was on a train passing through Staplehurst in Kent. There had been a misunderstanding. A construction crew had removed about 40 feet of track ahead of the train for repairs. That train, too, took a fatal plunge. 7 of 8 first-class cars went over. Dickens was in the 8th. It was turned over. He had to climb out. At the moment, though bruised up some, he was not shaken, and he went about trying to bring aid to people who were badly hurt. He'd cup water in his hat and bring it to them. At least one person died in his arms. He had the presence of mind to remember that he had a copy of the latest chapter of Our Mutual Friend, which he was working on, in his jacket, which had been left behind in the train, and he actually crawled back into the car to get it once everything was over with. It was only later, when he got away from it all, that he broke down. He lost his voice. There wasn't a physiological reason for that. He had no sore throat. It was just a stress reaction. He described himself as shattered. For the rest of his life, he had a problem with trains. He had a problem going everywhere sometimes, even in a horse-drawn carriage. He said, I have sudden, vague rushes of terror, which are perfectly unreasonable, but quite insurmountable. We call those panic attacks. This man, who was known for not just writing, but for reportage, for traveling, for doing dramatic readings on the stage in front of audiences, couldn't get on a train anymore. Maybe the effects on a ball player wouldn't be too different. Perhaps a week or 10 days after the accident outside of Bridgeport, Bresnahan told a reporter regarding his team's chances, this may not be a Cardinal year after all. Why would he have said that? They still had something like 60 games to play, and were only 5 games out. The answer was that something had changed. Hans Wagner, the great shortstop, said of Bresnahan, he could do anything. He could catch, pitch, play the infield, or play the outfield. He could hit, throw, and run. I'd say he was the most talented and versatile player in the history of the sport. He was also the Duke of Tralee, as the writers called him, a guy who could never be cowed or intimidated on the field, least of all by umpires. But he could be cowed. He could be intimidated. The Cardinals fell apart in the weeks after the accident, went 33-42 the rest of the way, finished 22 games out. So what can ruin a team's chances in a pennant race? Sometimes all it takes is a ticket to ride in the infinite inning. I'm Stephen Goldman, and this is the Infinite Inning Baseball Podcast. Hey, diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle. Cow jumped over the moon. She'll be coming down any time now, and her udders are looking very full, so get you deep underground to episode 21. You're too old for nursery rhymes, aren't you? It's very good to be talking to you again. I wanted to continue with the theme that I explored in our prologue with another tale of a catcher who might have gotten a little bit lost. The infinite inning is not solely about depression, and depression is not wholly what being in the infinite inning is about, but the two conditions do overlap significantly. In both states, words can operate on two levels, being humorous or pleading or angry, and simultaneously meaning something else altogether. I've often said that having depression is like saying, I want to go home, and you already are home. You joke about wanting the impossible, the contradictory, the quixotic, but it's not a joke. You really want to go home. The tragedy of it is that you're there, and you can't feel being there. It's got me now a little bit, brothers and sisters. It's not unusual for me. It's something I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but I'm very fortunate in that at this stage of my career, I am self-supervised, and if necessary, when the black dog has got me pinned to the canvas, I can disappear a little bit. And as long as I meet my deadlines, no one will really notice that I'm gone. I'm not sure what they assume that I'm doing between deadlines. See, the secret of freelancing, for those of you who are going to attempt it in your life, you get the assignment, you go away, and you turn the assignment in clean and ready to go. You don't trouble your editor with questions or extensions or anything unless it's absolutely necessary. Well, I misspoke slightly there. As someone who has spent many years working as an editor, let me assure you that you never ask for an extension. Extensions are for near-fatal illnesses and deaths in the family. There are no exceptions. So when I'm gone, I guess they assume that I'm working on it or indulging in some hobby, flying kites, perhaps. There's a character in Dickens like that in David Copperfield. He's absolutely nuts, but he flies kites, and that seems to make things better for him. I'm sure some of you who are of similar disposition have a more difficult experience in that you get up each day, you do that gut check, and for whatever reason, you've been turned down. The emotional thermostat has been dropped to a cold 40 degrees or something like that, and you still have to go to the cubicle. You still have to report to work. You still have to stand in front of the class and teach it, even though what you really want and need to do is pull the covers up to your nose and never get out again. Imagine being a ball player in that situation, having to go out on that field and perform to your utmost when all you want to do is hide. Well, there have been some. I strongly suspect that Mickey Cochran was one who would have understood what I'm talking about. The player I'm referring to, if you're not familiar with him, he's a Hall of Fame catcher, kind of an important one. I guess that's encouraging. I'm going to explain why I said that about Cochran, but I need to give you a little background first. Cochran, whose birth name was Gordon, came out of Boston University, rapidly established himself as a top prospect in the minors, and at 22 was a star in the major leagues, hitting .331 for Connie Mack on the 1925 Philadelphia A's. Mack was building a great team, which would win pennants from 1929 through 1931 and won the World Series the first two of those years. And Cochran was a big part of that. In the time that he was with the A's, overall he hit .321, and he had such a great reputation as a team leader that he was voted the AL MVP in 1928, a year in which he only hit .293, and the A's hadn't even won the pennant. They'd finished second to the Yankees. If you are not old enough to have seen Cochran, and I think very few people are at this point, as Casey Stengel said, most of them are dead at the present time. The player today who probably best matches Cochran, at least in output, is Joe Mauer. At least when Mauer was a catcher and playing at his best, in that both were left-handed hitters who emphasized patience and batting average over power. Physically, they weren't similar at all. Cochran was 5'10" and 180 pounds, and Mauer is 6'5" and 225. Although there's one other similarity. Their catching careers ended for broadly similar reasons. I'm not just talking about concussions, although concussions certainly played a role in the denouement of Cochran's career. There were injuries worse than concussions, and other things, heavier things, going on inside him as well. Connie Mack started to break up his great A's team, the one that had Cochran and Lefty Grove, Jimmy Fox, Al Simmons, Jimmy Dykes. Mack's camera eye Bishop let him not go unmentioned. In the early 1930s, the stock market crash had wiped him out, and the Depression was killing A's ticket sales, and he was of the opinion that the Philadelphia fans were taking his team for granted anyway. So he began selling players off for cash. A whole bunch of them went to the Red Sox. but not Cochran. In December of 1933, he was traded to the Detroit Tigers for a fringe catcher named Johnny Pasek and $100,000. And it should be obvious from the way I said that the $100,000 was the important part.
Hey, it's present day Steve interrupting past Steve to warn you of an incoming break. I go back and forth as to how mad we should be at Connie Mack for breaking up that great team. I do see it as tragic that he never could build another one. The Depression was the Depression even for the well-off, and Mack was well-off, not wealthy, and less so after the stock market crashed.
It was a good break for Cochran in that he always wanted to be a manager, and the owner, Frank Navin, was in the market for one. He had actually just tried to make Babe Ruth the manager because the Yankees were done with Ruth and they were looking for ways to kind of palm him off on somebody else, and they knew he wanted to manage. They also knew he wasn't going to be the Yankees manager, both because familiarity breeds contempt and because they really liked Joe McCarthy, and properly so. So they tried to broker a marriage between Navin and Ruth, but Ruth blew Navin off, and Navin decided not to wait, and it was a mistake that would haunt Ruth for the rest of his life. So Cochran became player manager, and in his first season with the team, the Tigers won the pennant, their first since 1909, and Cochran hit .320, picked up his second MVP award at a time when guys mostly didn't win second MVP awards. There was just a prejudice. It's as if Tom Hanks would only get to win one Best Actor award ever for Forrest Gump or something, and then the Academy was forced by rule to ignore Philadelphia or vice versa. Cochran's on-field leadership manifested itself in a really intense approach. It wasn't always positive intensity. On one occasion with the A's, he was catching lefty Rube Wahlberg, and Wahlberg was struggling. Cochran ran out to the mound. Regular mound conference, right? But no, he grabbed Wahlberg by the shoulders, spun him around so he faced center field, and kicked him in the ass. And then he went back behind the plate. Cochran's nickname was Black Mike. Some sources will tell you that this is supposed to reflect the color of his hair, which, to be honest, if you look at pictures, it's about as black as hair can possibly be. It is midnight on top of his head. But I think it also reflected his moods. Cochran was fortunate enough, both because of his own play and because of his teammates, to play in 5 World Series. The postseason was always really hard on him. In the 1931 World Series between the A's and the Cardinals, St. Louis's rookie center fielder Pepper Martin, who we've got to talk about more another time, hit .500, and he stole 5 bases in 6 attempts, and the A's lost in 7 games. And Cochran, as the A's catcher, was very much the GOAT of that series, although the A's lost for all kinds of reasons. Still, as sometimes happens, the fans just pick somebody to be the GOAT. The game of that series that left the most visceral impression was the second game, in that the A's lost that one 2-0, both on runs manufactured by Martin's base running. That game was also a 3-hit shutout by Bill Hallahan, so it's hard to say that all the blame was on the catcher. I mean, if you don't score, you could lose 1-0, 10-0, 100-0. It's all the same damn thing. All the runs after the first run are just gravy. They're redundant. Even though it shouldn't have all been on Cochran, he was ailing. He was distracted. He was trying to stave off the landlord because a bank failure had just wiped out his savings. It was the Great Depression, after all. And 2 years earlier, the stock market crash had wiped him out too, just like Connie Mack. Even if you throw that in, though, the pitchers played a role in allowing the stolen bases. They just weren't set up for it back then. It wasn't a base-stealing time. And Cochran also wasn't the one who allowed Pepper Martin to get 12 hits. Cochran was so exhausted during that series, which, remember, he's both catching and managing. He played during the day, and he spent his nights in the hospital. The Tigers won another pennant in 1935, and this time they beat the Cubs in 6 games for their first championship in team history, and as far as I know, Cochran got through all of that in good shape. No stolen base problems, no running back and forth to the hospital. But, and this is the problem with life, it doesn't freeze frame like the end of a 1970s sitcom. There's always another season. On June 4th, 1936, the Tigers were playing the A's in Philadelphia. The game was scoreless in the top of the third when the Tigers started pounding away at the A's starter, Gordon Rhodes. Cochran got to hit twice in that inning. The first time around, he walked to load the bases with no outs, and then scored on Charlie Gehringer's single. 2 pitching changes later, the Tigers are still going, having scored 6 runs, and when Cochran came up again, the bases were again loaded. The pitcher was now a fellow named Stuart McGuire Blythe, whose brief career in the majors includes just 39.1 innings, in which he issued 61 walks and, that year, a league-leading 16 wild pitches. This was a special guy. Improbably, Blythe actually threw a pitch in the strike zone, and Cochran lined it to right center field, and it reached the wall, and it bounced away from center fielder Wally Moses. 3 runs scored, and Cochran did too, an inside the park grand slam. We just saw one of those this year with the Nationals. He crossed the plate, stumbled to the dugout, and collapsed, though not wholly from the exertion of rounding the bases. "I don't know what happened," he said later. "I started to go to bat, but was suddenly seized by a dizzy feeling. Then my heart started beating at a rapid rate, and I thought I was going to die." This is what we now call a panic attack. He had been hospitalized for this reason before during the 1934 World Series. After this attack, he benched himself. He tried to manage for a few days, but when he tried to do a little running to see if he was up to getting back in the lineup, all those symptoms returned. "The heart fluttering scares me half to death," he said. He returned to Detroit, checked into the hospital, and they diagnosed him with a hyperthyroid condition. But everybody knew there was something else going on as well. Jimmy Dykes, his old teammate, the manager of the White Sox, said, "If Mickey had our troubles, he'd wind up the Zion check of the American League." Dykes, who never won anything, always thought he was funnier than he was, and this is an example of a joke in bad taste. Zion check refers to Congressman Marion Zion-Check, who had just jumped out of a 5th-floor window the previous August following a nervous breakdown. In the hospital, Cochran was allowed no visitors except his wife, no newspapers or radio, no baseball. Thyroid treatment doesn't require that. You do not get handled so gingerly. After 10 days in the hospital, he was sent away to recuperate on a Wyoming ranch. And again, if you think Wyoming is remote now, imagine it in the days before cell phones and satellite coverage. This was exile from all stress. This is nothing to do with your thyroid gland. He was away about 10 weeks out there on that ranch, finally returning to the team in August, though he barely played. He got into a total of 44 games that season. Given an offseason, he seems to have recovered. In 1937, he was back as the catcher-manager. He played well. He was hitting .306 through 27 games, but on May 25th, the Tigers were playing the Yankees in New York. Bump Hadley was on the mound for the Yankees. Cochran had homered earlier in the game. Another inside-the-park job. A very patient hitter, he worked the count to 3-1. The next pitch was way inside, up and in. It was not, as is sometimes reported, a beanball. Cochran recognized it was a ball, and he was taking all the way. Somehow, though, and he confirmed this later, he just stopped seeing the ball as it was closing in on him. He threw up his arm to defend himself, and he fell away, but the ball just kept homing in on him. It knocked him out. The next time anybody heard from Cochran, it would be in St. Elizabeth Hospital after hours of unconsciousness. The ball hit his right temple, just over the right eye. It fractured his skull in 3 places. The impact was audible up in the press box. One of the fractures went almost all the way around his skull. Another laced through his right sinus. There was some question as to whether he would live. The question wasn't so much internal bleeding or pressure, but the sinus fracture meant that infection might set in. While he was still in danger, his wife flew in by plane from Detroit to New York. She arrived at the hospital after 1 a.m. Cochran was sort of awake now. "Can I get you anything?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "A new head." Cochran wanted to play, but the Tigers said no, it was too dangerous, and although he attempted to manage, his heart wasn't in it, and his on-field career was over. I'm left, though, with the idea of Black Mike in that exchange with his wife. "Can I get you anything?" "Yeah, a new head." No doubt he meant it the way he said it at the moment, but given the contours of his life, the way that stress affected him, it applied the other way, too. Change out my personality. Make me new. And sure, his head hurt as well, but that was transient. The other stuff, Black Mike stuff, that was permanent. By Hercules' 11th labor, we have made it to the end of another episode.
Here is the part of the end credits when I used to tell you how to follow the guest on Twitter, but there is no guest and there is no Twitter, and such things are beyond my powers to repair. Thus, I will simply tell you that should you wish to follow me on social media, you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. Hope to see you there.
You can also write us at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and please, I beg of you, please, rate us at the podcatcher of your choice, iTunes or what have you. Every positive review helps keep this program alive. We have a sponsor now, but this episode is nonetheless brought to you by the number 16. Ever since I mentioned that Bill Bevins bit earlier in the show, My producer's just wandering about the office saying, "Here comes the tying run, and here comes the winning run," over and over again in a really bad Red Barber impression, but he won't get back to work. Our theme song, which you are listening to now and have listened to throughout the episode, was co-written by myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, and he and I are going to have bad Dunkin' Donuts coffee later because friendship is a garden, you have to tend it, and bad coffee is just the price you have to pay. Well, if I can just get the ghost of Leo DeRocher to get back in the closet and stop challenging me to a game of billiards.
That's all from both past and present me for this reissue episode. I'll be back tomorrow with an all-new episode 352. Be well until then, okay?